Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me for the defense of my dissertation, which is titled The Use of a Short Cycle Formative Assessment Observation Protocol to Investigate Alignment Between a Secondary Science Teacher's Beliefs and Practices, a Narrative Inquiry Study. I'm Joey Tedeschi, and my wonderful mentor is Dr. Sarah Pratt. So, the underlying problem that's really driving my research has to do with the centralized focus of standardized testing in the United States and how that is actually impacting secondary science educators' instructional practices. So many secondary science educators have described a kind of disconnect or cognitive dissonance between their beliefs on what science education should look like and what they find themselves actually doing in the classroom. So, although current research does address standardized testing pressures, there's a deficiency as to how science educator assessment perceptions align with their teaching beliefs and practices. So, the trajectory for the literature review really stemmed from the theoretical framework that I used for this study, which was Kirshner's cross-disciplinary framework. So I separated it out into four sections. So we had epistemology, pedagogy, assessment, and teacher perceptions. So, what Kirshner was saying from an epistemological standpoint is that embedded within learning theories are different approaches to instruction that really help shape an educator's pedagogy. So, for example, a behaviorist approach might be most effective if the end goal is for students to memorize some facts or learn some skills. So, there's a lot of repetition involved with that. From a constructivist standpoint, the main goal might be for students to be constructing their own knowledge and acquiring conceptual understanding. And then from a sociocultural standpoint, the main goal might be for students to develop a certain disposition within the classroom. Literature on pedagogy suggested that inquiry based instructional strategies are best at promoting conceptual understanding. However, direct instruction can be effective for teaching key points. Literature on assessment suggested that summative and formative assessments are very different, with summative assessments functioning as an accountability measure of achievement, and formative assessment requires the use of feedback to adapt instruction that will mitigate a gap in student understanding. Literature on teacher perceptions suggests that many science educators are experiencing a disconnect between their beliefs and practices. So many of them would like to implement more inquiry based instructional strategies, but they find themselves pressured to teach to the test and find themselves engaging in more rote memorization. So, really, the purpose of this narrative inquiry study was to thoroughly explore secondary science educators' epistemological beliefs, experiences, and pedagogical practices concerning chemistry assessment in a high school classroom. So, the aim of the study was to investigate the congruence of teacher beliefs and practices through the use of formative assessment enactment within the classroom. So, ideally, through this research, secondary science educators, as well as educational leaders, will be able to gain insight as to how facilitating a conversation with the teacher that helps them navigate and explore the alignment of their beliefs and practices, how that can help them traverse this disjointed terrain, which many educators describe, where their beliefs and practices aren't quite in alignment, causing this kind of feeling of disconnect. The first research question for this study was, what does Erica, the primary participant, reveal about how beliefs and practices inform and are informed by instructional decisions after engaging in teaching and reflecting cycles focused on formative assessment? And the second research question is, what does Erica, the primary participant, notice about the alignment between beliefs and practices when reflecting on formative assessment enactment? So the cross-disciplinary framework really outlines what alignment looks like with respect to learning goal, learning theory, and instructional practices for each learning metaphor. And then the assess today involves a protocol that collects conversational and observational data that can be mapped back on to the cross-disciplinary framework and inform where within that framework an educator is currently situated. And it allows for the reflection and evaluation to see if there is alignment between an educator's beliefs and practices. So the theoretical framework I used for this study was Kirshner's cross-disciplinary framework. If we look at the table to the right, it basically shows that there's three main learning metaphors. So there's habituation, construction, and enculturation. And within each learning metaphor, there should be alignment among what is obtained, the learning theory, as well as the pedagogical practices involved. So Kirshner wasn't saying that one learning theory is better than another. Instead, he was saying educators should have alignment among what is obtained, the learning theory, and the pedagogy, or the instructional practices. So for example, habituation, what is obtained would be skills, and that comes out of the learning theory behaviorism. So from a pedagogical perspective, we should see instructional practices focusing on proficiency with routine exercises or repetitive practice. So construction would be focusing on students building knowledge of concepts, and this would be using elements of constructivism to do that. So some practices we might see in the classroom from a pedagogical perspective would be things such as conceptual restructuring, perhaps a lecture or discussion where students are actively building knowledge
and applying it to new scenarios. And then finally, enculturation, dispositions are what's being obtained. So perhaps like a growth mindset. The learning theory coming out of that would be sociocultural theory. And some of the pedagogy we would see would be some modeling or coaching and culturally appropriate participation within the classroom by students.
So for this research study, I chose to do a narrative inquiry study because I really wanted to focus in on one person over time and see how they navigate the alignment between their beliefs and practices, and how they manage potential disconnect along the way. So there was one participant, Erica. She was a teacher participant throughout the entire study. And as far as data collection goes, we started with a pre-interview aimed at gathering insight into Erica's epistemological beliefs as well as preferred pedagogy and assessment perceptions. From there, we engaged in 3 teach and reflect cycles using the Assess Today short cycle observation protocol, which entailed me being a non-participant observer in the classroom and then facilitating a debrief discussion with Erica after each classroom observation and unpacking the formative assessment enactment within the classroom, focusing on things that she could do potentially better in the future. From there, we also engaged in a post interview where Erica shed light on her beliefs and practices once again, as well as the assessment perceptions that she has. And to the right, we have the adaptation of the cross-disciplinary framework. Here you can see I have an outline of the cross-disciplinary framework in black there, and then I'm mapping the data points that I collected back onto the cross-disciplinary framework to investigate if there is or is not alignment among Erica's learning targets, beliefs, practices, and assessment styles. So you can see in red there using the pre and post interviews to inform certain parts of the cross-disciplinary framework, as well as the teach and reflect cycles. And then after that, we also engaged in a follow-up interview several months later during a new school year to see how this research has impacted her and if Erica going through this research process had any long-lasting impacts with regards to Assess Today or any reflections from the process. As far as data analysis goes, I organized the data, transcribed it, and uploaded the transcripts to NVivo, which is a qualitative software program. Then I conducted a first cycle coding for each data collection point separately, noted patterns using memos, coded using the cross-disciplinary framework, and then mapped the data back onto the framework, as you can see over there to the right. Then I conducted a second cycle coding on the compiled data, where I wanted to identify additional codes, generate categories, generate themes, and develop some thematic statements. And I also composed narrative stories from the emergent themes where I synthesized the experiences described by Erica and that I observed to construct a cohesive narrative that was really focused on Erica's story and how her beliefs and practices and the alignment of those shifted over time.
The first major finding came from mapping all of that data onto the cross-disciplinary framework. So in table 3.4 to the left there, we can see the adaptation of the cross-disciplinary framework informed by data collection. So from the Teach and Reflect Cycle 2, Erica was operating under the habituation learning metaphor, where students were mastering stoichiometric calculations, so they're mastering skills. Um, a lot of what we were seeing and discussing in the debrief came out of behaviorism. So there was a lot of repetition of specific mathematical steps. Um, and the objective was really proficiency with these calculations. So being able to convert from moles to moles or convert from grams to grams. There's a lot of repetitive practice and a lot of practice problems. And Erica was able to um, assess if students mastered the skill through an individual practice problem at the end of class. And in Teach and Reflect Cycle 1, we had Erica operating under both a construction learning metaphor and an enculturation learning metaphor because there was more than one learning target. One of the learning targets for that specific Teach and Reflect cycle was concepts, where students were developing and revising knowledge about formal charge and resident structures, and ultimately the limitations of models. So there's a lot of pedagogy coming out of constructivism that we were seeing. So students were building their own knowledge and they were connecting mathematical models to physical models of chemical reactions. Also, there was enculturation within that, where students were obtaining certain dispositions, such as having a growth mindset, self confidence, and really taking ownership of constructing their knowledge. So the learning theory there was out of sociocultural theory, and the learning environment was really shaped in a way that promoted collaboration and development of these dispositions.
Second, engaging in multiple teach and reflect cycles using Assess Today can be an effective tool secondary science educators can use to reflect and analyze the congruence among learning targets, beliefs, practices, and assessments. So ultimately, providing a way for educators to debrief and reflect on their teaching. So can really sit down and isolate what the learning target was, what instructional practices they used, how they assessed whether or not students were able to meet the learning target, and then if all those things are in alignment with their beliefs or not. Third, adding an assessment component to the cross-disciplinary framework allows for an educator to see the alignment of their beliefs and practices through reflection, which promotes making adjustments that can potentially alleviate some feelings of disconnect between their beliefs and practices. We saw how she was able to recognize specifically that her assessment enactment was not in alignment always with her personal beliefs and practices. So she was able to recognize that she needed to start making adjustments to how she was implementing assessments and really thinking about what data she was getting from those assessments and how it was connecting or not connecting to the ultimate goal of the lesson or the ultimate learning target. So I think there are a lot of implications for secondary science educators as well as secondary education leaders. So to start, secondary science educators can utilize Assess Today to analyze a congruence between their beliefs and practices in an effort to alleviate any disconnect that they might be feeling. Uh, so by using Assess Today and going through teach and reflect cycles, these debriefings allow for the conversation to lead to making a more explicit connection between beliefs and practices. So when these components are mapped back onto the cross-disciplinary framework, there can be a clear indication of if there is alignment or not. And going through this reflective practice really provides educators with an opportunity to make adjustments to planning, to instruction, and assessments, ultimately promoting personal growth and a more consistent alignment within the classroom. And then secondary education leaders, I would recommend that they start to engage educators in teaching and reflecting cycles and really start to help them facilitate conversations around the importance of the alignment between beliefs and practices, then reflecting on that alignment. So it can really help educators recognize gaps in their teaching and promote stronger alignment between beliefs and practices. And this process can also be applied to professional learning communities and help facilitate professional growth among educators that way. So they can unpack the alignment of their learning targets, instructional practices, assessments to see if what they're doing and what they say they're doing and how they're assessing it is all in alignment. So an overview of the distribution plan, I think the target audience should be secondary science educators, as well as secondary science and math leaders, because those are the people that are going to get the most out of this research, in my opinion. And also the instruments that I utilized are validated for both science and math. So presenting at some sort of professional academic conference, I think would be the best place to distribute these findings. So either the RCML or National Science Teaching Association. And the reasoning behind this is first, I think secondary educators will have an opportunity to see how they can reflect on the alignment between their beliefs and practices, and how doing so can help potentially mitigate feelings of disconnect. And both of these places will also have a lot of secondary education leaders, and they can really see how this is an opportunity to help educators start to have these conversations around what they think it means to know. So the epistemology piece, as well as how they think one accomplishes that acquisition of knowledge. So the pedagogy piece, and then they can really start to engage the educators in these teaching and reflecting cycles, um, and really build on that opportunity for the teachers to recognize the importance of creating alignment between beliefs and practices, and helping facilitate that growth within their organization. And these are my references. And I just want to take a second to say thank you to everybody who has been involved throughout this entire journey, um, friends, family, and especially the dissertation committee. Thank you for your time. And I appreciate all of you and all of your support. And Dr. Pratt, thank you for helping me persevere through all the challenges. And no matter what, find a way forward. Thank you.